We play a fantasy wargame where nothing makes any sense. Lore comes and goes like waves of a fever, but nothing really changes, leaving us confused and uncertain. We hear familiar names like Cathay, Araby and Ind, but they ring unconvincing and hollow. It is 2010 and we cannot imagine a better world, but somewhere in the deepest bowels of Nottingham, Warhammer lore is about to change forever. It was a cold autumn morning when members of Games Workshop's senior management visited Warhammer World's fantasy department. What they saw shocked them. The game that had pioneered the company, the orcs that inspired Warcraft, the Chaos Warriors that inspired Space Marines, wasn't inspiring anyone anymore. Years before Duncan or Rob's rosy cheeks loomed into our hearts, Games Workshop's undisguised contempt for customers stood out even among game brands, a relic of Fordism. They cared about product, not PR, and only communicated with fans via their less anti-Semitic version of the Dearborn Independent. However, as management surveyed the crumbling husk of Warhammer Fantasy, they realised what this had cost them. But then, someone had a strange idea. What if they tried the antithesis of Warhammer Fantasy's stagnant derivative approach to lore? What if they were to finally resolve their narrative stalemate, have chaos blow up the planet to continue the story in a setting that would blend fantasy and myth into something unique? The words Age of Sigmar were spoken for the first time. What they didn't know is that this would unleash dark forces in the heart of the Warhammer community. The launch of AOS was a challenge to old players, in the sense that AOS felt like the Challenger launch to old players.
Looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance.
The game peppered improv cues into wargame mechanics, and didn't even have a point system. This imbalanced mix of Warhammer and Cards Against Humanity vindicated the prejudice of the worst fans, who already disliked a milieu that wouldn't encourage them to freehand Deus Vult on European Crusaders. It was no tragedy when these whingers storm off, cast out in eternal resentment, but AOS had acquired a bad reputation. Wargamers scattered in a diffusement of bemusement, and soon many Games Workshop stores faced closure since no one could live with the shame of switching to 40k. And then, something strange happened. Stories set in the Mortal Realms were published, good stories. Models were coming too, each release more aesthetically daring than the last. While forums still echoed with jokes about Sigmarines, AOS was synthesizing its potential. Now, the Mortal Realms represent the most interesting setting Games Workshop has to offer. This video is about that setting. None know how long Sigmar clung to a lifeless chunk of his dead world, but he eventually made his way to the Mortal Realms. The Mortal Realms each correspond to one of 8 winds of magic. Rather than being planets, these are vast lands of solidified magic that hang within floating realm spheres. The realms connect through networks of realm gates, but they connect in stranger ways too. Shyish houses the living dead, and across its lands are underworlds that reflect the afterlives that various societies believe in. Hysh and Olgu are caught in an endless orbit, eclipsing each other to create day and night for the rest of the realms. This is how it is in the Mortal Realms. Lands separated by void, yet intimately bound together. Sigmar realised he was not the only god that wished to recapture what had been lost. There were those intent on rebuilding replicas of their homelands, like Alariel the Everqueen or Nagash, Lord of Undeath. There were the renewed bonds of Dwarden brothers, Grimnir and Grungnir, as well as Marathi and her son Malarian. There were the elf gods Tyrion and Teclis, twins who dreamed of recapturing a traditional past, like the Lech and Jarosław Kaczyński of Warhammer, and there was Gorka Morka, the Ted Kaczynski of Warhammer. Sigmar thought that unifying the Pantheon was the way to bring order to the mortal realms. This was the start of the Age of Myth, and a new system of management was about to emerge. Sigmar found common ground even with his most difficult peers. He set aside his millennia-old grudge with Nagash, and they bonded over building civilization. At the same time, he channeled Gorka Morka's destructive energy to defeat monsters that terrorized the realms, the great bones of Gur's landscape a reminder of that era. Meanwhile, the elven gods managed to ensnare Slaanesh. This chaos god had devoured the souls of the entire elven race, and now they planned to extract them. Teclis's first experiment resulted in the Ideneth Deepkin, half-souled elves who felt deeply the power of nightmares and fled Teclis's scrutiny into the ocean. However, subsequent attempts proved more successful, and the elven gods slowly restored their people. But as the gods flourished, they retreated into their own worlds. The alliance was fracturing because no one shared a collective vision of power. Soon, Pandora's box would open, and the dream of a united pantheon would die. We don't know exactly how long the Age of Chaos lasted, because Age of Sigmar lore is about as comfortable with dates as a Sultana lobbyist. What we know is this reaving time lasted many long centuries of the Self. The Chaos Gods were a group of horrific deities from another plane of existence that craved domination. The Blood God Khorne, Fate Master Tzeentch, Plague Father Nurgle, the followers of the absent Slaanesh, and the Horned Rat, upstart deity of the Skaven. At the head of their armies was Archaon the Everchosen, a being so dangerous that he destroyed the old world, so dangerous that the Chaos Gods initially rewarded his service by trying to kill him. At first, the Alliance of Order held firm. They defended the All Points, a subrealm which housed realm gates connecting to every other realm, but then Nagash neglected to reinforce them, and when Sigmar lost his magical hammer Galmaraz, the All Points fell under Archaon's control. Sigmar raged at Nagash's treachery and launched a vengeful invasion of Shyish. He would soon abandon his fight and retreat to purge Azir of Oryx, indigenous dragon ogres, and everything else that might taint his perfect realm. While he and Grungni worked on a secret project, the other realms burned. Apart from the isolated Deepkin, or the Dwarden that took flight to found the first Caradron skyports, few escaped Chaos's wrath. Some realms were focused on by a single god, like Nurgle coveting Gairan, or Khorne's grip on Akshi. Even the Shyish underworlds weren't safe after Archaon shattered Nagash's mind. Gorka Morka's ilk seemed to enjoy all the fighting, but this was the trap, and disunity only helped Archaon's plans. It looked like any who resisted chaos were destined to go the way of all flesh. But soon, a strange new army would come that would change the balance of power in the realms forever. There are many things to say about the Stormcast Eternals, about 26 minutes worth, but the key element was the reforging of souls. Sigmar fashioned an army out of the souls of heroes he gathered from across the realms. He even plundered the underworlds of Shyish, and the occasional lightning bolt stealing the soul of a brave spirit confused the Mortarchs as they tended to Nagash. Should these reforged warriors fall in battle, their soul would be drawn back to Azir to be reforged anew. However, Sigmar mobilized before the delicate art of reforging had been perfected. Chaos had so totally dominated the realms that Khorne's forces were getting restless and turning on their allies. This was the present time when Age of Sigmar launched in 2015, but unlike the static pre-climactic deadlock that characterized traditional Warhammer Fantasy or 40k lore, Age of Sigmar would be told as an unfolding narrative. We weren't given calendar dates, but we had something more important: causal events that tied together, plot threads that were paid off or developed. This wasn't just lore, this was a story, and as the hammers of Sigmar struck down on the Brimstone Peninsula in Akshi, a new chapter of the story had begun. On Akshi's Great Parch, the last vestiges of civilization were scattered tribes yet to be subsumed into the cannibalistic hordes of the Khorne Bloodbound. The Fireslayers, worshippers of the shattered god Grimnir, joined the Stormcast to liberate these ravaged lands. The cause was assisted by the mysterious Seraphon, the ancient slan that summoned starlight lizards from a forgotten age. Essentially, the Stormcast had become a prism that focused the competing interests in the realms, a symbol of hope for the downtrodden masses who wanted to rebuild civilization, an exciting chance for Khorne's followers to test their mettle. Some, like the Beastclaw Raiders, simply saw opportunity to further their survival. These ogres were cursed to eternally flee a predatory blizzard in search of food, and while they discovered Stormcasts were not a good source of meat, the battlefields that they left behind were. But Sigmar did not unleash his forces without a plan. He knew the best way to establish a presence in the immortal realms was to capture networks of realm gates, and so erupted the REALMGATE Wars. Tzeentch planned to align Shamon's realm gates and connect them to the domain of chaos. He was siphoning the power of Galmaraz to do this, and had constructed a many-layered fortress to hide the light of Sigmar's stolen hammer. The Celestial Vindicator Stormhost managed to recover this artifact, but at great cost. When their Lord Celestant returned, a withdrawn and erratic man, the imperfections of the reforging process had begun to show. At the same time, the Hallowed Knights tried to break Nurgle's control of Ghyran. Their blundering tactics forced Alarielle out of her isolation, which earned them the distrust of her Sylvaneth, but their alliance was strengthened as they fought Rotbringers together. But then, something strange happened. When the Celestant Prime struck the Nurgle warlord, Torglug the Despised, with Galmaraz, his soul shot back to Azir to be reforged. Taunus became the first of many redeemed Chaos Warriors, a symbol that they were not just reclaiming land, but people too. However, they did not afford a second chance to everyone. In his quest to acquire powerful god beasts, Archaon attempted to bind Behemat, Ghyran's dormant titan. The Stormcast preemptively killed Behemat as he woke, forever angering his Gargant kin. They were among the many that rejected the Stormcast's offer of alliance. The Grots and Orcs that Gorka Morka had once brought into the Pantheon did not see the Stormcast as returning friends. Meanwhile, disturbing news had come from Shyish. Stormcast souls which had been dispatched to parley with Nagash had not returned. The wars concluded in a multi-realm offensive to retake the gates to the All Points. Archaon had claimed this nexus as his headquarters, renaming it the 8 Points after Chaos's 8-pointed star. Though Archaon successfully defended his base, Stormcast alliances with the Sylvaneth and Fireslayers had secured victories in Ghyran and Akshi. The war with Chaos was not over, but as Sigmarite cities were built around captured realm gates, they secured pockets of relative peace. Over the next few hundred years, Hammerhall became a beacon of Sigmar's project, nicknamed the Twin-Tailed City because the borders sprawled across both its Akshi and Ghyran halves. These diverse cities attracted many outside cultures, such as Marathi's Cainite temples, the Seraphon's skink ambassadors, or profit-seeking Caradron overlords. What had emerged was a system of 4 powerful ideologies, known as the Grand Alliances. Sigmar's allies pioneered an alliance of order to re-establish civilization and survive the threat of chaos. Grand Alliance Death also strove for law and stability, but, like the Chaos Gods, Nagash wanted total control over the realms. Grand Alliance destruction rejected Chaos and Death's domineering ambition for something closer to Order's goal to simply flourish, but they would also reject centralized authority and even industrialization. One could map these Grand Alliances into 4 quadrants, whether the management system skewed lawful or disorganized, and whether their existential objective was survival or domination. You may see tenuous pacts between Grand Alliances with overlapping ideology, but order and chaos, or destruction and death, remain fundamentally incompatible. These quadrants are a little like the political compass, except where one describes coherent ideological differences with real-world applications, the other is the political compass. In the respite following the Realmgate Wars, the cities of Order thought they had found peace. But this was a fantasy. Nagash was angry at Sigmar, the Elven gods, as well as Chaos, for stealing the souls he had laid claim to, and his retaliation would set the stage for the Soul Wars. Each mortal realm contains Realmstone, the crystallized essence of that realm's magic. This material becomes more plentiful at the edges of the realms, a saturation of magic that makes the outskirts uninhabitable. Nagash sent his undead legions into these outskirts to fetch the Shaishian Realmstone, Grave Sand, to the central city of Nagashazar for a great ritual. Portents of this ritual spread, and soon the irreconcilable forces of Order and Chaos clashed on their way to do the same thing: stop Nagash. But it would be an underestimated enemy that proved his undoing. The Skaven possessed the ability to create gnaw holes, allowing them to burrow through reality without using realm gates. From their corner of the realm of chaos, Blight City, they schemed to infiltrate Nagash's Black Pyramid and disrupt the great ritual. However, a group of Skaven made a fateful mistake. They accidentally opened a gnaw hole at the bottom of the Shyish Sea, which resulted in a flood that killed millions. But the flooding of Blight City would have a strange side effect. The drained seabed revealed enclaves of the Ideneth Deepkin, who had been raiding souls to replenish themselves in secret for generations. Now that they were receiving unwelcome attention from an enraged Nagash and the forces of Slaanesh, the Deepkin entered an uneasy alliance with Order. The Skaven had made a costly error, but they had managed to interfere with Nagash's spell. The ensuing necroquake was still a devastating explosion of death magic that would have dire consequences. Across the realms, the dead rose and attacked Nagash's enemies. Magic went haywire and seemed to acquire a life of its own. The necroquake had even inverted the very geometry of Shyish, with the Black Pyramid burrowing into the realm's centre to create a nadir of pure death magic. The lands of Shyish were slowly but inexorably pulled towards this funnel. In some ways, the necroquake had accomplished the opposite of what Nagash had wanted. It made the realms a wilder, less orderly place, but it had also consolidated his power, allowing him to use the souls like never before. He marshalled 2 new armies, the Nighthaunt, ghastly spirit subjected to eternal punishment for breaking Nagash's law, and the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, expertly crafted bone vessels for multiple souls. He would try what no one else had dared: invade the 8 Points. Archaon had at long last found where the elves were imprisoning Slaanesh, but Nagash's gambit forced him to rush back and defend his home. The 4th Chaos God was not freed. The Soul Wars would also reveal Sigmar's great lie. The Stormcast Eternals had inspired the seeds of hope that flourished into pockets of civilization across the realms, but it seemed they were not eternal. There had been growing concern about the cost of reforging. Now, Nagash was intent on reclaiming what Sigmar had taken, and in the tug of war, Stormcast souls lost parts of themselves, memories and emotion, until there was little left but armour and magic. It sums up the strange mood of the time. The Stormcast call themselves eternal, yet it seems that behind the gleaming gold, they are just as fleeting as everyone else. We live in a constant vaudeville of faction names like Gloomspite Gits or Ossiarch Bone Reapers. With names as complicated as this, how can we hope to grasp the worlds that they inhabit? But the reason for these odd faction names is stranger still. The everyday viewpoint characters of the Mortal Realms are Sigmarite citizens who have Holy Roman Empire aesthetics. If the point of view characters are supposed to be Germanic, perhaps the compound words in these faction names represent the compound words of the German language. Even in English, Age of Sigmar lore is in German. This theory would be the last straw in a video that was already pushing its luck.
This is a film about how all of us become... And to understand how this is happening, you have to look to Russia, and to a man called Vladislav Surkov, who is Richard Nixon, but nobody seems to know. It sums up the strange mood of our time, where nothing really makes Richard Nixon come...
Okay, as you might have noticed, this is a pastiche of Adam Curtis docs. Second video in a row I'm imitating someone, but I guess the difference is that Curtis slapping 9 Inch Nails or Burial over stock footage is kinda dope, whereas Arch rolling every R in cultural Marxism makes me want to swallow 9 Inch Nails and have my burial. Curtis is a sort of Chomsky type, in that he's the most anti-establishment voice the British establishment tolerates. He does have many good critiques, but also some limitations.
Why I like people like Weber is because they're challenging what I see as that crude left-wing vulgar Marxism that says that everything happens because of economic forces within society, that our ideas are just froth on the deep currents of history, which is really driven by economics. I've never believed that. I spend my whole time just looking at how ideas have consequences.
Now, I may be a crude Marxist, but I can't deny I often talk about superstructure, culture, over base, forces of production. I liked the Frankfurt School enough to make my Reddit username a shitty pun. Oh, and I'm also literally making political videos about Warhammer, but that's pretty based. I've heard liberals criticise Curtis for making conspiratorial reaches, but I think the issue is more concrete. Curtis is good at mapping causal relationships between ideological shifts, but reluctant to embrace historical materialism. Curtis uses the term idealism a lot, usually about stuff like the naive horizontalism of the Occupy movement, but the irony is his work sometimes suffers from an idealist approach to history. Hypernormalization is Curtis's most ambitious film. Look how Wikipedia assigns a coherent thesis to his other stuff. Gets to hypernormalization and it's like, shit be confusing, bro. The film has several dissatisfying strands. Among them is his description of the Soviet Union.
The original dream of the Soviet Union had been to create a glorious new world. By the 1980s, it was clear that the dream had failed. One Soviet writer called it hypernormalization. You were so much a part of the system that it was impossible to see beyond it.
Okay, failed why? Failed how? Curtis only mentions the Soviets to explain the concept of hypernormalization. There's also his take on Syria. He outlined how Kissinger's constructive ambiguity strategy destabilized the Middle East. Okay, with you so far, but then ends up implying that Kissinger spiking Hafez al-Assad's plans for Palestine basically turns him into a loose cannon character from a Shane Black movie. The betrayal is pathologized as a rubber ducky moment, so everything Syria has done since, from Hafez all the way to Bashar, is all an attempt to avenge Kissinger's crimes.
Assad raged about this treachery. He told Kissinger that what he had done would release demons hidden under the surface of the Arab world.
Maybe I edited that a little. Curtis's documentaries work best when they don't undermine materialist explanations. For instance, Century of the Self's focus on the commodification of psychology really suits his ideas-orientated approach. The Power of Nightmares is a good polemic about how Western neoconservatism mirrors the rise of Wahhabism and dismantles the frenzied mythologizing of Al-Qaeda. So, what the fuck has this got to do with Warhammer? I'll admit that part of this was just wanting to make an AOS lore primer with an entertaining twist. Curtis's style is easily parodied, but engaging. Well, I think so. And I didn't fall asleep when we watched Hypernormalization together, did I, Dawn? But I think this style is particularly well suited to describing Age of Sigmar lore. Some people call Curtis films unfocused, others praise his ability to weave a coherent chain of causality from a wide swath of events. His documentaries are strange, disorientating explorations of interconnected events and ideas. And doesn't that sound like the elevator pitch for AOS? I wanted to emphasise how the Mortal Realms are a vast setting, but its stories depict vivid networks of causation. It's partly due to AOS being an unfolding narrative, but I think the sometimes frustratingly vague timeline actually helps. Sure, having set dates and a fully mapped out world provides its own satisfaction, but a loose approach to the where and when necessitates a focus on the how and why. Like, one of my favourite chains of causality is how Nagash's falling out with Sigmar causes him to plot a great ritual, which leads the Skaven to opportunistically sabotage it, which has the unintended consequence of Blight City flooding, which exposes the Idoneth Deepkin, which forces them to make alliances, etc, etc. And I do sort of enjoy the way AOS lore embodies Hegelian idealism. In this case though, the Worldgeist is a real guy, and he's got plans for your shoes. As I hope is obvious from the lore summary, it's quite easy to think of the chronology in terms of dialectics. You can trace the development of the ideological underpinnings that would form each of the four grand alliances, and find the coherent distinctions behind their vaguely synonymous names. That can play into great man notions of history, just like other GW games, maybe with fewer men, but it does create satisfying conflict. Then there's the fact that AOS seems very concept driven, as opposed to Warhammer Fantasy's focus on doing a grimdark spin on existing historical cultures. You know, what if dwarves were Babylonian? What if Egyptians were undead? What if we've not read Edward Said? AOS still uses a medley of iconography borrowed from historical cultures, but now the focus is on creating interesting paradigm shifts of fantasy archetypes. What if the immortal heroic champions of the downtrodden had deteriorating souls? What if elven reclusiveness took them all the way to the sea, but their self-preservation brought them back to steal your soul? Speaking of souls, this is a good example of why AOS isn't necessarily anti-materialist. The two primary phases of AOS lore have focused on material conflicts. REALMGATEs are a transportation infrastructure, and souls are a labour force. This video has been about the grand narrative of AOS, but your best entry into the setting is really through perspectives of individuals that you get in novels. Josh Reynolds having done for the Mortal Realms what Dan Abnett did for the Imperium. This is how Warhammer has always worked. Rulebook lore leaving the details of production to be explored in novels or RPGs. And if you're interested in RPG content, check out Queensberry Lodge, who provided a voice line earlier for some pretty cool Warhammer lore deep dives. More like Winsbury Lodge End. You think I'm pausing out of shame? Fuck you, that was good! And I guess that's the last reason for Age of Curtis, tone. His films have an atmosphere that renders the familiar strange and alienating. I do sometimes think that the tone of AOS gets misunderstood as whimsical. It's out there, sure. If the end times was a messy divorce, then AOS is a hot couple's wedding. Cause, as a friend put it, everyone's fucking glowing! But strange and whimsical aren't synonyms, so while you have your zany corners of the Mortal Realms, it's not a setting that lacks weight or stakes. AOS uses the contrast between high fantasy weirdness and everyday mundanity to its advantage. The tensions between Hammerhall's various inhabitants is fun, and I especially enjoy the logistics that a two-realm city calls for. How Hammerhall Aksha has to divert lava through the realm gates to stem Gairan's ever-growing vegetation, while requiring water reserves from them in return. It's a huge setting of unmapped wilds and god beasts, but it's a place people have to live in. This is a different tone to the overpowering vastness of 40k, a grimdark setting that depicts a universe of cruel oppression without hope or respite. AOS has its share of bleakness and horror, but the dominant tonal register is a bit different, and it was something I was trying to get at with my use of incongruous illustrative footage. If 40k's dominant tone is grimdark, then the natural comic subversion of it is the bleak silly incongruity, like a Khornate champion picking up severed heads and doing some juggling. If AOS places more emphasis on fantastical strangeness, then the subversion of this tone is the strange mundane incongruity. That would be a Khornate Skull Reaper doing the skull accounting to make sure they aren't in breach of demonic contract and at risk of being handed their P45. I think the latter is funnier because there's a larger gap of absurdity between relatable mundanity and the totally bizarre, hence Mark Cornrigan. Anyway, that's my video. I wanted to create a succinct overview of AOS lore and also have an excuse to discuss Adawn Stirtis, who I still like despite my quibbles. I can be a fan of something while having some criticisms. See? That intro about Warhammer Fantasy being shit was a joke. I mean, I couldn't hate a setting that facilitates Blood Bowl. Blood Bowl is kinda weird, isn't it? One small idea takes over the world. Oh, wait, God, no, I feel the Curtis overtaking me, no, no! But then, something strange happened. After the discovery of a temple dedicated to the forgotten god Nuffle, a new sport spread across the world like a virus. All wars were subsumed into the Blood Bowl movement. One Kislevite writer called it